Hello guys, and welcome to another video. Now in this one, we're going to be discussing the Transcendence keystone a little bit. And the inspiration for this was Kanagi's Molten Strike Pathfinder from Hardcore Trade League in the Trial of the Ancestors. The footage you can see in the background is the build in action. Credit to Kanagi for this build and the video, and I'll link Kanagi's channel and the video in the description below if you're interested. Now I know you're thinking this is just another nearly immortal Pathfinder build, we've seen it all before, and this is true to some extent. Pathfinder is incredibly strong right now, and this has spawned some of the strongest builds in the game. But what's so interesting about this build in particular is the fact that it's running 55% maximum elemental resistances. This is usually the first thing that you think about when solving the problem of Transcendence. That's the giant maximum resistance penalty that it imposes on your build. Some will decide to try and mitigate this downside by scaling maximum resistances through gear, possibly through the use of something like Melding of the Flesh, and most will make use of Lore Weave to completely offset this downside. But Kanagi ignores it completely, even using Eternal Damnation, which applies a further -5 to maximum resistances. And yet, the build is still very tanky. So what exactly is going on here? Let's take a look at the POB. Similar to Ben's build that I went over a while back, Kanagi's Pathfinder has a whole bunch of defensive layering going on. Firstly, because the build isn't using Lore Weave, that frees up the body armor slot, which makes reaching 100% physical damage taken as elemental a lot easier. So Kanagi is of course using Lightning Coil for 50% of physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage, combined with Dawnbreaker for 18% taken as fire, and then a further 8% on the crafted Corel modifier on the helmet, and lastly, 24% taken as cold on the Taste of Hate flask, improved by flask effect, for a total of exactly 100%. The build also has 100% chance to suppress spell damage, made easier to achieve on the right side of the passive tree using the Inveterate Wheel and Entrench down here, with the rest of the chance to suppress spell damage being made up on gear and a single tattoo. Inveterate also provides an extra 3% of suppressed spell damage prevented. That 100% chance to suppress spell damage is also being used to help cap elemental ailment avoidance through the use of Ancestral Vision, for 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments. The remaining 50% is made up from the Thick Skin Life Wheel down here, and the Eldritch Implicit on boots. Next up is Transcendence, which is gained from the Militant Faith Timeless Jewel in the name of Maxarius. This keystone applies Armour's damage reduction calculation to elemental damage instead of physical damage, and as we already went over, this build takes no physical damage from hits, it's all being shifted into elemental damage instead. Transcendence also applies a very large maximum elemental resistance penalty on the character. Now Kanagi isn't using a granite flask, and there's barely any increased armour taken on the tree, so where is all of the armour coming from? Iron Reflex is being used in combination with Determination and Grace, and these auras are being boosted up by about 50% aura effect. There's also the increased armor modifier on the Ruby Flask, which is boosted by Flask effect and ends up granting about 100% increased armor, which ends up bringing total armor to around 100,000. Next is Eternal Damnation. This unique amulet imposes a further -5% to all maximum resistances, but grants elemental damage reduction based on half of your total chaos resistance. In this case, it's providing 35% additional elemental damage reduction, which, unlike the mitigation provided by Armour from Transcendence, this one also applies to elemental damage over time. Since it's a Pathfinder, we of course have the Flask setup providing further mitigation and a bunch of recovery. The Ruby and Topaz Flask both provide 20% less damage taken to fire and lightning respectively, which is increased by Flask effects to grant 38% less fire and lightning damage taken. The Taste of Hate is also a Sapphire Flask with the same modifier for cold damage taken, improved by Flask effect to grant 33% less cold damage taken. Kanagi is also using the Pathfinder's Master Surgeon, providing an enduring like effect for life flasks. And this means the Divine Life Flask is providing about 2,000 life recovered per second. Lastly, of course, the staple for any tanky Pathfinder build, the Progenesis Unique Flask, which makes 25% of the life loss from damage taken from hits be prevented and instead lost over the next 4 seconds. This flask is also improved by Flask effect, boosting this percentage up to 41%. So let's put all of this together in an example. Let's say this character came across a big scary monster which hits the Pathfinder with a spell that deals 30,000 physical damage. 15,000 damage is taken as lightning damage, 7,800 is taken as fire damage, and the remaining 7,200 is taken as cold damage. Firstly, resistance is applied, mitigating 55% of the damage. Then, Armour provides elemental damage reduction due to Transcendence. Importantly, Armour is applied separately to each elemental damage type, making the reduction that it provides much more effective because Armour is stronger against smaller hits. Before Armour's reduction is applied, the additional elemental damage reduction from Eternal Damnation is added to this reduction to provide a total percentage of elemental damage reduction, which is hard capped at a maximum of 90%. Then, the less damage taken modifiers on the Topaz, Ruby, and Sapphire flasks come into play, providing 38% less lightning and fire damage taken, and 33% less cold damage taken. And because the hit was a spell suppression is also applied, providing a further 53% less damage taken. Lastly, if Molten Shell is not active, the damage taken would be lost from life, so Progenesis prevents 41% of this damage, and this portion of damage is instead lost over the following 4 seconds. So the character would lose 237 life instantly, and 164 life over 4 seconds. So a total of 401 damage was taken from a 30,000 damage hit. You can see how ridiculously tanky this build is, even with 55% maximum elemental resistances. But to understand the true strength of this setup, we need to take a look at elemental penetration. This build was designed to go deep in the Delve mines, and one of the common, very dangerous modifiers that appears on the nodes as you go deeper and deeper is elemental penetration. The thing is, penetration is less effective when the target has lower resistances. For example, if a character had 90% fire resistance and they took a hit of 10,000 fire damage, they would reduce the damage by 90% and take 1,000 fire damage. But if the monster also had 10% fire penetration, the damage would be reduced by 80% and the character would take 2,000 fire damage. This means the 10% fire penetration has caused the character to effectively take 100% more damage than they otherwise would have taken. If the character had 50% fire resistance, they'd take 5,000 fire damage, and against the same hit with a 10% fire penetration, they'd take 6,000 fire damage, an effective increase of 20% more damage taken. You can see where this is going. Kanagi's build is extremely effective defensively against elemental penetration, because not only does it have much lower maximum resistances compared to the average build or even many other very tanky setups, but it also has many layers of mitigation to offset any increased damage taken from penetration. Now, unfortunately, Kunagi's character died in the Delve mines around depth 1900, and of course, it died to the same thing as Ben's Pathfinder did. Yes, the kryptonite of Pathfinders, the dreaded Flask Siphoner. But it's interesting to look at the Transcendence Keystone and look at when you should scale Armour versus when you should scale maximum elemental resistances, especially considering that Armour is typically much easier to acquire than maximum resistances. The balancing tightrope here, of course, is elemental damage over time, which is naturally very dangerous if you're unable to offset the heavy resistance penalty on Transcendence. Kunagi's build did this with elemental damage reduction provided by Eternal Damnation, and the less damage taken from the Flask setup, and of course the life recovery from the Life Flask. If you're able to invest in sources of mitigation against damage over time though, it may be much more beneficial to scale Armour when using Transcendence, as it's typically a lot easier to gain meaningful amounts compared to maximum resistances. This comparison is almost impossible to showcase as it will be very different on a build by build basis. For example, Kanagi's build only had around 180% increased armor, so modifiers to increased armor would still be quite effective. But a build on the left side of the passive tree may have 300% or more increased armor, so these modifiers would be less effective of an investment. Hopefully this video was helpful to showcase this rather underutilized method of using Transcendence. Perhaps this will be more popular when the relatively easy access to maximum resistance scaling from tattoos is gone next league. Did you use Transcendence in a build this league? Let me know how you scaled your defenses and how you got on with it in the comments section below. We're just a week away from the content reveal for 3.23 Affliction League. I hope everyone is excited for the new league. And a big shout out to my channel members for your continued support. It's very much appreciated. Just liking my videos and subscribing is more than enough, and it makes a huge difference. But if you want to go above and beyond, you can join these legends and become a channel member. Find out more by clicking the join button below. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.